is Sarah Omar, and I'm an assistant professor in Arabic and Islamic Studies here at Georgetown University. I'd like to welcome you to our series where you get to meet scholars and hear them discuss their intellectual journeys. My guest today is Dr. Zareena Grewal, associate professor at Yale University. Dr. Grewal, welcome, and thank you so much for being with us.
Thanks so much for having me. It's great to be here.
So I'd like to start by having you tell us a little bit about yourself and what brought you to your areas of research.
I have to say, I'm somebody who almost didn't go to college. When I was 18, I was working in a record store and I would get free tickets to concerts and free CDs. And I thought I could not imagine a cooler job or that I'd ever want to do anything other than that. And so, but I did end up going to college and I got old and uncool. And so I think at 18, I could never imagine that I would become an academic or become, do the kind of work that I do, but I really do love it. And when I think about it, when I think back to being an undergrad, I really didn't have a good sense of direction. I wasn't particularly bookish, but I was someone who, got relatively good grades, and I had a couple of critical interventions from mentors who were also themselves first-generation college students, working class, and who identified, in me a kind of curiosity about things, and they're the ones who really urged me to think about graduate school and to think about coming back and getting a PhD. So when I graduated, I majored in anthropology after having had several different kinds of majors. I ultimately landed on anthropology, and it was almost kind of by accident. And part of what drew me to the field was I would my whole life kind of been obsessed with questions of race and difference. And it was a way to think through questions in my own community, in the communities that I was attached to, Muslim communities, but also, racial and ethnic communities, to think about immigration in a certain kind of way and being a second generation immigrant. And then also, I was so perplexed by this field that to me was claimed that, race was a social construct and yet was filled with all these racist ideas and the legacy of that. And so that was my undergrad major. But when I left, I graduated, I actually became a first grade teacher, and I love being a first grade teacher. But I had two mentors who kept pulling me back and saying, no, come back to grad school. One was Sherman Jackson, who was my both undergrad mentor, but also my in grad school, one of my co-advisors of my dissertation, but also Ruth Behar. And he specifically did not want me to go into Islamic studies, but to go into a field where I'd be able to really look at Islam in the United States without that being constrained. And so he really was pushing me towards American studies, and I did actually apply to American studies and get into American studies, where I work today. Ultimately, I transferred into anthropology and history at Michigan, which was at the time where a lot of the kind of lefty Marxist energy was at Michigan. Postcolonial studies, that was sort of their kind of informal postcolonial studies program. And I grew up in a very kind of leftist Pakistani family, and so that was very familiar to me. And so that was where I was trained. And then I started thinking about what are the kinds of driving questions. I knew I wanted to work on something related to global Islam. And actually all of my work has been in some ways connected to the questions of Islam, race, and, the global and local dimensions of it, thinking about those different scales of communities and connections and the flows of ideas and people across borders and connections. And so the first book is about those ideas, but also my first film, which was a project I took up in grad school, which was about Mahmoud Abdul-Rauf, who was the Kaepernick of the 90s. That was a side project, really became a big project for me, but also was taking up those same kinds of questions. And really, I guess, one of the things that was really driving my thinking and has for many years is what is it that compels us to follow certain authorities? I guess I bring that back to working in a record store. Why do people love certain albums so much, or certain celebrities? Why, how is it that what is authority? Why are we so compelled by certain people and persuaded by their thinking and modeling ourselves after them? And that's what I wanted to think about. And so I guess in some ways, that's really the question that I keep coming back to, both in terms of politics as well as in terms of religion. And those things are always overlapping for me.
So I'm wondering, given the scope of your research and what you've been working on, the types of questions you've asked and how those questions have actually changed over time?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that, when I look at like one of the first journal articles I published was actually my undergrad senior thesis, if you can believe that, which was looking at intra-racism and colorism among Arab and South Asian communities, and also the ways in which kind of like, Muslim dating practices, I guess you could call it, in these mosque communities, and interracial relationships, and the ways in which religion and culture get opposed to each other, sometimes in the ways in which Muslims talk. So that was sort of that first project that I did. And I was, of course, at that time myself, like 22, and surrounded by, young people talking about these things all the time, and often in battle with their parents. And so I kind of took on that project. But it actually became, for me, it was less about marriage and coupling, and much more about race and religion, and this idea that Islam could somehow transcend either colorism, racism, parents' traditions or traditional or social conservatism or not, right? And I wanted to think about that. So when I look at that, though, that even that earliest project, that's the thread that I think has always been there, is that I've always been interested in the ways in which race and Islam intersect, because that's just something I've heard my whole life, and I've always thought about those things, and also my own family. So much of the ways in which I was even the Islam that I grew up in was so profoundly anti-racist. The way my parents looked at Islam, the way the communities that I grew up with a million khutbahs, all of that stuff, which was, so I wanted to think about that critically. But I think the biggest change is over time to be able to think more and more about empire as a category, U.S. empire as a category. It's always been there, but I think that really the influence of Indigenous studies, and also, of course, post-colonial studies, but to really think about, and of course, Black studies and just to really have a more sustained focus on the category of empire is, I think, something that has come a bit later to my work. And also, engagements with things like affect theory or queer theory or other things that have, I think, shaped the work that I'm doing now, which is a book about the Quran as a racialized text object. Those are some real shifts, I think, from when I look at my earlier work.
I guess a follow-up to that is, how have your approaches or methods changed as the fields you're working within are changing? Because
that's a great question, I have to say. So I because I was in a program, the interdisciplinary program of anthropology and history at Michigan, and Michigan is a very interdisciplinary program, a university setting. And so I've always been interdisciplinary, and then coming into a job in American studies and also in religious studies, these are all interdisciplinary fields. So I've always been at the intersections of anthropology and history and culture studies and ethnic studies. But I think that one of the things that's changed or shifted for me is my students have taught me to do things that I was never trained to do. So, for example, in this new book, it's so much more profoundly, I'm doing a lot more close readings of texts, because my students have expertise in literature, and so they've kind of taught me how to do that. Specifically, Najwa Mayer and Amina Al-Anan in particular are two graduate students that I got to work with, who really taught me so much about how to do that. So this new book project that I've been working on for the last several years is really, I was trained by my students in how to do that. And that's, I think, something that we don't often realize, is that, these are dynamic relationships. It's not so top down. It's often, we're as formed by our students as our students are formed by us.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for your time and for being with us and sharing your intellectual journey. It's been such a delight and such a pleasure.
Thanks so much, Sarah.